Well, welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco's Social Issues Forum. I'm John Buehrens, the past senior minister of the congregation, and our forums beginning this fall are all focused on the crisis in housing and its relationship with homelessness. This has been one of the key issues for our congregation. Certainly the chief issue that our Economic Justice Task Force has worked on. And we are very lucky to have three wonderful guests to discuss the problem with over the next 3 weeks. With us today is a reporter for the New York Times and the author of the best book that I've read on the housing crisis. Conor Dougherty is the author of Golden Gates, The Housing Crisis and a Reckoning for the American Dream. And thank you for being with us, Conor. I think I want to start by asking you, the book seems to come out of a period of very rapid political shift here in the Bay Area, but also more widely, away from fearing development into putting more emphasis on the need for building housing. Was that political shift what prompted you to write the book?
Thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for being here. So I moved, a little bit about me. I grew up in the Bay Area, mostly in San Francisco, and then I went to high school, middle school and high school in Napa Valley. My parents, my dad still lives in Noe Valley. I'm actually visiting him today with his grandson, so I'm sitting in my childhood home here in Noe Valley. So I had been living in New York for 10 years, and I moved home. And I lived in the Mission District, about 7 blocks from my parents. And it's sort of funny. I was joking to people that I, felt San Francisco was a place that so many people were moving to and were so excited about and coming there. And I felt like I'd been sort of, called back to the farm to, take care of, Anyway, so I was living in San Francisco, and the housing thing was going crazy. And I, obviously housing has always been an issue here. I lived here during the dot-com boom. So it just felt like an interesting thing to write about. Mm-hmm. And I had met Jeremy Stoppelman, who was the CEO of Yelp. And one day we were having a conversation about antitrust, something totally unrelated. But at the end of the conversation, I said, hey, I heard you're very concerned about housing. It's an issue I'm really interested in, want to write more about. What's up? What do you find interesting, whatever. And he told me he had given money to this activist named Sonia Trauss. And I looked her up, and she ran this organization called BARF, which stood for the Bay Area Renters Federation. And it just struck me as odd, and she was very bombastic personality. And it just struck me as odd that Jeremy, who, is a CEO of a publicly traded company, and if you have ever met him or he's not one of these sort of he's not like an Elon Musk type, talking about, he's not sort of some libertarian ideologue, and he's not even really particularly, he's a very straight-laced guy. He comes off as like a guy who has to file, SEC reports every few months or whatever. So it just struck me as odd that here was this guy giving money to this activist who had a caustically named organization and everything. So I met Sonia one day for coffee. She was every bit the bombast that I thought she would be. Showed up to our meeting in a orange Crown Victoria covered in glitter, which is like basically an old 70s police car. It was bright orange and covered in glitter. She had fluorescent clothing on, and and she was very intellectual, would sort of mix her philosophy on things, referencing, biblical texts and philosophers, all sorts of, but then would mix that with, very caustic language. Anyway, I wrote a story about Sonia, and I thought that would be it. I thought that would be the end of it. I wrote a story about how here's this woman who had, started an organization to fight for more housing. And the reason I wrote that story, for what it's worth, is economists had been talking about this problem for a long time, but it really was nothing. It just existed in policy papers. And I felt like Sonia was a sort of an indication that this was starting to break out of academia and becoming sort of an activist issue. So I thought that would be the end of it. A couple weeks after that story ran, I get a call from a guy in Boulder, Colorado, who says, we are having a national meeting called Yimby Town that is going to be of activists sort of like Sonia from around the country. And I thought, well, this is odd. So I went to Boulder for the meeting, and it's like every city that is has a large tech industry or is sort of the winning city, if you will, in that region, and they aren't all big cities. I mean, Nashville is sort of a very growing city. Minneapolis, not a city people think of as, I mean, if you've spent time there, it's a wonderful, beautiful city, but it's not a place people think of as being, on par with California in terms of its cost problems. But all around the country, from Denver, from Seattle, from Minneapolis, from Boston, there were there's 200 something people. They were mayors, they were activists, they were planners, they were all sorts of different people were there, all complaining about the same problems, and they all had the same political dynamics. They were talking about local problems, but they were so similar. I mean, there was almost no variation in them. And that was the moment I would say that I realized, okay, this one little story about San Francisco that I wrote, this is something bigger. And
Right.
I didn't start the book for a little while, but that was definitely the germ of it when I realized this is happening everywhere.
So this is an acute case here in the Bay Area of something that's really quite national. I mean, one of those statistics that leapt out for me, Conor, was that in the last decade here in the Bay Area, we have produced 8 times as many jobs as we have produced additional housing units.
Yes,
that's a prescription for a housing crisis.
Yes, and it's changed. It's changed a little since then, but yeah, no, I mean, we continue to have a huge problem with this, and in any one year we might make up a little bit of ground, but then then we'll fall apart for 5 years. You know what I mean? It's really like 3 steps back, a half step forward.
5 years ago, when I would raise housing issues before people in the congregation and beyond, I think the entire focus was like the focus in Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted. It was on displacement, eviction, gentrification, and fear of further development. And I think that's because much of the development that took place in San Francisco in the first decade of this century was indeed luxury housing, high-end housing. But now there seems to be a great deal of emphasis on the need for more affordable housing. And it's not just at the local level, it's in the national level. Desmond was calling for a huge increase in Section 8 vouchers, which is saying that would really be the best solution in national policy for fixing the housing crisis. And lo and behold, it's in the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill, which of course Joe Manchin this morning announced he won't support, which may kill it. But there's at least an intention at the level of the Biden administration to more fully fund housing for, I would say Section 8 tends to cover the working poor.
Yeah, I think just to unpack that a little tiny bit, for people who aren't, complete housing aficionados, Section 8 is a program that a lot of people have heard, but ultimately it's a program that gives a voucher to low-income renters, and it pays the difference between the market rate rent and what an affordable rent is, which is about 1/3 of their income, right? So they are responsible for some of the rent, and then the rest is paid by the voucher. This is a program that is about $25 billion a year, which means that about 1 in 4 people who qualify for it actually get it. And this is why in pretty much every city in America, there are years-long lines to get Section 8 vouchers. A line that can be a decade in many places. And many cities have just stopped taking applications, because if you have a decade backlog, what's the point in signing new people up? So more fully funding that program, and I think what's an important, this gets into, again, Washington speak. Section 8 is what's known as an appropriated amount, which means it has to be passed by Congress every single year. Every single year we have to say, yes, we would like to spend that 25 billion, right? Which is different from an entitlement, which means anybody who's entitled to it gets it. What's important about that is think about something like the mortgage interest deduction, which is very important to Californians who tend to have obviously higher mortgages because their homes are worth so much more. Everybody who owns a home can claim that tax benefit. It doesn't, if you can claim the mortgage interest deduction, and we don't, if too many people claim it one year, we don't say, oh, the rest of the people don't get it. As many people who are qualify for it can have it, and the money is appropriated. The money goes up and down as people claim it, and that's different from Section 8. So I think that really, leaving aside all the little details, I think what's important for people who, again, aren't housing wonks to absorb is we treat people who own their own homes so much more fairly than we do people who, we say, oh, people who own their own homes, as many tax breaks as you need, don't worry, they'll be there for you. Whereas people who can't afford a rental home, we say, well, if we run out of money, sorry. And it turns out, 3/4 of the people who qualify don't get it. I mean, could you imagine what would happen if, next year they told people, you know what, 3/4 of the people who get the mortgage interest deduction aren't going to get it because we ran out of money for that. There would be, people would flip out. Everyone in Congress from a urban district would be talking about it. And I just think within that, get past, forget about the details about appropriated versus entitled. That it just, there is a real philosophy in there that is kind of part of our poison, which says, if you're renting a home, we're just going to treat you totally differently than if you own the home.
Right. I hope my sound has improved a bit. I had to adjust. Let's see. Does this help a bit? Any change? No. My sound is still distorted, people are telling me. Any improvement now?
It's a little better, I think.
Okay, good. Someone jostled the adjustments on my microphone, and I regret that. I want to point out, by the way, that you can use the chat or the Q&A function, and Robin Larson at the end of this session, in the last 15 minutes or so, will help direct some of your questions to Conor and myself. The forces that have been preventing the development of affordable housing strike me as being really rather complicated. And you said in a conversation we had yesterday, Conor, that you're not so much concerned about the people who caused the problem in the first place. That includes homeowners organizing to keep multi-unit housing out of their neighborhoods, so-called exclusionary housing zoning. The state of Oregon has just banned single-family exclusionary housing throughout the state. Do you see anything like that happening here in California?
Yes. So just to kind of unwind some of what you said, for people who aren't total aficionados. So this is a problem decades in the making. And people started writing about that the Bay Area was creating a huge housing problem in the mid-70s. In 1977, Time magazine had a cover story that said sky high housing, and was all about housing being out of reach for people. So and it's not really, it's only gotten worse, over that time. And homelessness has gone from something that really appeared in the early 80s to now we just live with it. We just pretend that it's always been this way, but it hasn't always been this way. And so I think what I said to you yesterday is that even though the origins of this crisis can be found in the very anti-development attitudes that sort of took over California in the middle 70s, or they really kind of started bubbling up in the 50s and 60s, but they found their legislative and legal might in the 70s. I guess I just sort of, I feel like at that time there were real things people were fighting against. You know, there was a plan to pave the bay. There was, you know, all sorts of open space laws that had to be passed. You know, Muir Woods was created and protected. That's a federal thing, but nevertheless, I think the Headlands is state land. So, you know, there were, you know, there are things that happened that were good, right? But what I feel happened is, I think a lot of people are okay with a general philosophy that says, let's leave these beautiful, wonderful, wild open spaces as they are. Maybe build a trail or whatever, but that's about it, right? And let's direct housing towards these urban spaces so that we're putting people in the most environmentally conscious way kind of together, and where they can have transit options and all that sort of stuff. And let's leave nature alone so we can, you know, right? The problem is that we never did that. We, you know, a lot of our activism in housing, meaning activism to prevent development, is done to prevent development in urban neighborhoods. There are more CEQA lawsuits filed against infill developments, which is in theory the most environmentally conscious thing we should be doing, than there are against sprawl. We have created, you know, a situation where we make sprawl considerably easier than we do politically and otherwise, than we do the infill housing we say we want, right? And the reason is, as Jerry Brown once said to me in an interview for my book, cows don't tend to complain as much as people do. And, you know, when you build in the middle of nowhere. So there has been a backlash. So what I was sort of trying to say to you is that, like, a lot of people want to play like a kind of, you know, blame game on people in the 70s. And I just don't find that particularly productive. You know, it was a different time, and who really cares? But we now know the kind of the consequences of our actions. We know that it leads to much higher home prices. We know that higher home prices have, you know, have knock-on effects in rents, which have knock-on effects in homelessness. We know that living in a more dense urban environment is the absolute one of the best things we can do to arrest carbon emissions. We know that having more housing options leads to more diverse neighborhoods, right? And more and less income inequality, and less, perhaps more importantly, less wealth inequality. So now that we know all these things, it feels like if we're still fighting against them, we're kind of willfully blind at that. You know, maybe the people in the 70s, it was early enough, people didn't really get it. There wasn't enough track record to, and obviously they were fighting against different forces. So, okay, so where are we? Well, around the country, there have been a lot of moves to sort of undo single family zoning. And they take kind of two forms. One form is a bunch of these laws that are allowing what are called accessory dwelling units, which is basically backyard cottages. And then there are laws that are allowing duplexes and triplexes. Minneapolis, in about 2 or 3 years ago, became the first major US city to essentially get rid of single family zoning by allowing triplexes in any on any lot in the city. And Oregon soon followed with a statewide law that allowed duplexes on any lot. And numerous other cities and states have subsequently at least discussed some sort of law like that. California passed a duplex law. Now you could, well, real quick, you could argue California actually did all of this before Minneapolis and Oregon, because in 2016, we passed a law that allowed accessory dwelling units essentially anywhere. And there have been numerous other laws that have subsequently really strengthened that kind of first law, right? So that's one thing. And then this year, really just about 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I wrote a story about this, the California legislature passed a bill called SB 9 that will allow lot splits and duplexes on any lot. It really does not change things that much for all the vitriol directed towards it. The ADU law was actually, that was passed many years ago, sort of semi-quietly, was actually much more powerful. Um, and that law is on Gavin Newsom's desk. He is, for obvious reasons, not talking a lot about what he's going to do right now because he's in campaign mode. I suspect he will sign it shortly after Tuesday, but we'll see. So I think my answer is I think California will probably join Oregon this week.
Interesting. So your interpretation of that law is that it effectively ends single-family exclusionary housing statewide.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, the term exclusionary is, you know, an adjective, or you know, meaning there is some interpretation in the word exclusionary. The single-family zoning is like a hard fact. You know what I mean? Like it says you can only build one-family homes on this plot. If you allow somebody to build a two-family home on that plot, will that make the neighborhood less automatically not exclusionary? There's a kind of judgment call in there. But I suspect Newsom will sign it this. I have no inside information whatsoever.
Right.
I just feel like if he wasn't going to, he would have made that abundantly more clear.
And of course, he's done a good deal in his budgeting in the recent years to address both homelessness and affordable housing. $12 billion over 2 years for additional funding for homelessness, and $10.5 billion to bolster affordable housing across the state. I think there is a growing recognition by our political leaders that we are in a housing and homelessness crisis. In fact, if the governor was paying attention, the single biggest reason cited behind the recall was lack of action on the problem, particularly of homelessness.
Yeah, so, and I think this is an important thing to sort of just kind of get out there. I think that affordable housing is exactly what we need, and it's really great. And I think we should investigate public housing and, you know, do all these things that have worked in other countries and worked actually quite well in this country for a long time until we defunded them and, you know, basically disinvested in them. You know, there was actually a book called When Public Housing Was Paradise. And it's true, we used to have great public housing in this country. And now, of course, we think of it as disinvested in and substandard. I mean, you know, the biggest slumlord in New York City is New York City. You know, anyway, but there's two important things here. One is, for extremely technical reasons that I could spend a lot of time talking about, but won't, we build affordable housing and market rate housing in almost identical ways. They're zoned, they're obviously zoning is the same. They're built by the same people, same construction units are kind of, you know, teams of construction workers, the same contractors, subcontractors build them, you know. There are nonprofit organizations that act as the developer, but they still just go hire the same people that a for-profit developer does. So how they are, you know, how, aside from how they're paid for, there's almost no difference. There are some small differences, but they're not important, at least not when it comes to the overall construction timeline. How we build affordable housing and how we build market rate housing is not that much different, right? So if we want to make it easier to build affordable housing, I mean, it's not to say you can't do things that just put affordable housing to the head of the line, and people have tried to do that, right? But you know, the two are part of a package. The other thing is too, most tenants live in market rate housing. That is the case today, and that is going to be predominantly the case for the foreseeable future. And I also think that when you talk to tenants, and I spend a lot of time talking to tenants, particularly undocumented folks and people who are really living the struggle of high rent, what they want is a cheaper place to live. They want the option to be able to go to Craigslist and be like, okay, there's something that kind of fits my needs. You know, I'm not saying that they have to and they're not saying, I need the biggest place in the nicest neighborhood. It's just we're something that's like reasonably close to my work, that reasonably works for me. Yeah, we might have to have a couple people in a bedroom, the kids share a room. There's going to be, differences, but how do I find something that works for me? And making the sort of predominant private housing market work for those folks a little bit better is not that is not like an unworthy goal, right? I particularly since no matter how much affordable housing we build, unless unless we build thousands and thousands of units a year for many years, it is going to remain the case. And I think that just as we need to start creating affordable housing now, which is why affordable housing is so important, because the market, we also need to try to make it easier for those folks. Because you go anywhere in the Bay Area, and candidates will tell you this, there are all sorts of places that have 10, 20 people, or I'm not 20, but I've seen 15 people living in a house, right? And finding a way to sort of make that easier, I think is not an unimportant part. And this gets controversial because a lot of people say, oh, it's pro developer and pro whatever. But I mean, why are single family homes excluded from our definition of luxury housing? A decent size, a nice home in San Francisco was like $2.5, $3 million. And then we're like, oh, stop the $3,000 a month apartment. And you're like, look at there's like a kind of dissonance here, which doesn't seem to recognize
in your book, Conor, it was a sort of odd bedfellows coalition between the Council on Affordable Housing, the CHOO, and the West Side neighborhood groups and some of the Board of Supervisors in opposing certain changes that would make affordable housing. Out here where I live in the Richmond district, the mantra is we're in favor of affordable housing provided that it's 100% affordable. And one of the things that I've parsed is that means that one of the nonprofits will do it all, and it will all be very low income people, probably receiving supportive social services because they were formerly homeless.
I don't think, yeah, I think that's, I think that there's nothing wrong with 100% affordable housing.
Right.
But I think that stance, ends up doing more harm than good because it isn't looking at the problem holistically. Do we look at healthcare that way? Do we look at food insecurity that way? You want to sort of ask the way I came to this problem is like, what have various people said on this topic and where have they basically ended up, right? And all sorts of people, very liberal economy. Elizabeth Warren, go look up Elizabeth Warren's quotes on housing in the Democratic presidential debates. She said, we have a supply problem. That's what she starts with, right? So this isn't exactly, a libertarian icon saying this, right? So I think that stance does more harm than good. Let me just give you a little anecdote. In Palo Alto, an affordable housing group proposed the development, senior affordable housing, right? And what they were going to do is they were going to they got a plot of land and they were going to create some very high-end luxury housing. And I think they were going to sell it or rent it, right? And they were going to use the subsidy from that to build or to fund the ongoing subsidy needed for this low-income senior. And it was really even moderate, but low to moderate senior income or senior housing, right? Okay, this got passed by the Palo Alto City Council. Neighbors around the area did an initiative to stop it. So these people were so up in arms about this low-income senior housing that they spent their Saturdays and Sundays going around the city collecting clipboards. They could have been writing novels or spending time with their kids or doing any other thing besides going around the city collecting signatures, but they were so outraged about this, they decided to spend their own lives doing this. They referendum qualified, the referendum passed. This project gets stopped, right? What happens? Well, what happens is the affordable housing developer is discouraged. They sell the land to a for-profit private developer who then goes and proposes a series of single-family homes on it that start, the cheapest of which is $5 million. And all these people who were so up in arms about the senior housing, it didn't have enough affordable housing, are suddenly absent. They didn't, suddenly all the time they spent on their Sundays collecting signatures, well, they had something else to do all of a sudden when the guy came with the $5 million house. So there was a project where they were literally, weeks away from starting construction on a few on precious affordable housing in that place. Because of this political process and the years that have transpired since then, that never got built, and they're getting only multi-million-dollar homes instead, right? And I think that when you have that all or nothing stance, a lot of that starts to happen. And each year that passes, you get less overall affordable housing. Plus, why shouldn't we cross-subsidize it? Why should taxpayers be the only ones to fund affordable housing when you could cross-subsidize it with luxury housing rents? I mean, it's sort of an odd stance, right? I want my tax dollars to be the only thing paying for affordable housing. I don't think the person living in the $3,000, $4,000 a month unit should be cross-subsidizing it. That's a very weird stance to have.
And there are also issues about whether the urban area should be the only area dealing with the housing crisis, which is regional and in fact statewide and in fact national. And we're going to be getting to the state level issues and the regional issues over the next two sessions. But one of the things that has stood out for me as I've worked on these issues here in the city is that most people don't seem to realize that San Francisco is already supporting 20,000 supported low-income housing units for people with mental illness and substance abuse issues. That we are adding to that stock at the rate of about 1,000 a year. But there are almost no other communities in the Bay Area that are doing similar things.
Okay, so you bring up a good point. San Francisco has actually done much better on housing in general and affordable housing in particular than many of its neighbors. In fact, here's a statistic I always like to point out. In Palo Alto, they have about 4 jobs per housing unit. San Francisco's got about 2.5 or 2 or something like that, right? Cupertino is 3.5. Mountain View, where Google is 3+. And Menlo Park, where Facebook is in that same neighborhood. Palo Alto is the worst. It's like 4.2. Manhattan, which is the sort of prototypical, nobody lives there. I mean, obviously a lot of people live. My point is the daytime population is so much higher than the nighttime population. They got, various trains, ferries, highways, tunnels. I mean, there's all these different ways they have to get people in and get people out, to accommodate the daytime working population. And even Manhattan has I think it's 2.5 jobs per housing unit, right? So Palo Alto at 4, they are more Manhattan than Manhattan. Sort of ironically, they always say, don't Manhattanize our city. And you're sort of like, well, seems like you did a pretty good job of that all on your own. Anyway, my point is that the Silicon Valley is a sort of, I cannot find a situation like that anywhere else in the country. It is a truly, truly extraordinarily weird and lopsided situation. You have these cities that really kind of hold themselves as these kind of suburbs, right? And yet they build office space that is, consistent with a much, much larger city with a pretty substantial downtown. I mean, look at that Apple spaceship. That is the equivalent of a skyscraper. It's on its in a circle, so it doesn't go straight up. But I mean, in terms of the number of workers that go there, that is a very large skyscraper, and um, they never built they don't seem to have ever tried to increase this housing supply. It's really telling too, because there is a hearing, you can go find it on YouTube, where Steve Jobs comes in to the final planning hearing for that building, and he comes and stands before the Palo Alto City Council and says, we would like, to build this new headquarters, and we own the land, and blah, 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 blah. And the city council goes and asks him every single right question. Oh, what about affordable housing? What about, how are we going to accommodate all these new jobs, right? I mean, so they clearly know what they're talking about. And then they just, approve, don't build any more housing. And then somebody wanted to build an affordable housing, a mixture of office and affordable housing about a mile from there, as the crow flies, on the site of an abandoned mall, which you've driven by it. It's like, it is abandoned mall. It's the worst eyesore you can imagine. And everyone was up in arms. Oh, the city didn't like it, and a neighborhood group sued. It's just I would say that in terms of the lopsidedness of the jobs housing imbalance, the Silicon Valley is one of the most extreme situations I've ever seen, much, 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 much worse than San Francisco. So I understand when people in San Francisco say, why is everybody always picking on us? Look at what our neighbors are up to. That's a fair posture. And this just shows why you need some kind of regional coordination. I mean, there was a huge fight recently with Brisbane and San Francisco. Anyway.
To what extent do you think housing speculators buying units and holding them off the market, or things like the perverse effect of Prop 13 with taxes going up once a property is sold, but how do these things play into the situation in the Bay Area?
Prop 13, obviously, I think Prop 13 affects things, but in ways people don't quite, it's sort of hard to, here's what I think Prop 13 does. San Francisco is not that dependent on property taxes, right? So if property taxes were a much larger funder of the government, people would sort of recognize that the priorities that they wanted to sort of, whether they're drug rehabilitation programs or mental health programs, or, I mean, all the programs you want to do in your city would be coming from property taxes, right? And that's typically how it is in other cities, right? I think that I think that activists in San Francisco would sort of be more naturally pro-growth if they sort of knew their meal ticket was property taxes. So I think that Prop 13 sort of rewards a kind of anti-development mindset. So I think that's one thing. As for what was the other question you had? There was something else you brought up.
Speculators and holding properties off the market. I'm always struck by how many empty storefronts there are in my neighborhood, for example, with in areas that could be redeveloped for more affordable housing, right along Geary Boulevard.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I guess. I don't think that's the term speculation is one I have a sometimes hard time with. If you are buying something purely to hold it and leave it empty, I get, there are empty parcel taxes and other things that people like Vancouver have tried to use. I think those are good tools. But the term speculator gets thrown around a lot and oftentimes doesn't seem to mean what I think it means. So for instance, there are house flippers. There are people who go and buy a rundown home for $1 million, put significant renovations into it, and sell it for $2 million. And then people complain about that as if the person who did that has some magical ability to make it be worth $2 million. Well, the reason it's worth $2 million is there's a lot of $2 million home shoppers in San Francisco, and they're all kind of looking for a place that is move-in ready, and they don't want to go through the sort of business, so. I don't really think of that as speculation, as catering to the market as it is, right? And if you had more competition and more new housing, that wouldn't be such a great business, right? So I think that true speculation, which is, buying something and holding on to it purely for it to go up, I don't think that happens nearly as much as we sort of pretend it does. I do think, I think when you start talking about people building like, condo buildings with 10, 20, 30, 40, $50 million units, I don't know that we have 50, but we definitely have like 10 and 20. I think that discouraging projects like that, I think that makes some sense, I guess. I mean, what I try to think about is things that meet some genuine need, right? There are $4,000 a month, 1-bedroom luxury apartments in San Francisco, but you know what? There's a lot of young workers who make a fair amount of money and perhaps work at a technology company in Soma, and they rent those apartments. They, eat dinner, and they do all these other things in that neighborhood. They are part of that neighborhood. They are part of that kind of ecosystem. They live there, they pay rent there, they spend money there. I guess I'm like not that offended by that type of luxury. But when you start having, multi-million-dollar condominiums that are truly just bought to hold, and I don't even know that they're more bought to get hard currency out of China. I don't even know that the people who buy them care if they make money. They basically want to buy dollars. I think discouraging that kind of thing, yeah, that makes some sense. But when you start talking about kind of higher end apartments for the local workforce, that doesn't bother me nearly as much.
Well, let me turn to Robin and ask her to unmute and maybe turn to the chat and help direct some questions and some commentary from the rest of the participants in this forum.
I can answer. Okay.
Well, I thought maybe
I see some of them.
Yeah, I thought maybe I'd ask the people who've already sent in commentary beyond John's sound. We can eliminate all those. That they could read their own commentary, and then if anybody wants to respond to what they say. So Deborah Baldwin is the first who talks about some of the roots of some of our homeless problems. Deborah, are you here somewhere?
Yes.
Would you like to read aloud what you wrote for everyone, and any other comment you want to make?
Well, I said, while I acknowledge the lack of affordable housing, some of our homeless problems were caused by the Roseburg, California Supreme Court ruling about not being able to keep mentally ill folks unable to follow their treatment regimens institutionalized, resulting in many mentally ill homeless. So we need to do a much better job at more funding for more supportive housing services, because a lot of people who have a real negative attitude about the homeless are focused on the mentally ill, and you constantly hear people talking about service resistant. No, they don't want to live on the street. They just don't like the alternatives that are offered to them for like one night at a time shelter beds, where they basically have to give up everything they own to get in. They can't take their pets in, they can't stay with partners, they can't stay with their community that they've developed, and they need help following their medication regimens. And because there are insufficient outreach and supportive services, a lot of them self-medicate, which is where we get all of the drug abuse on the street.
And let me just add that we'll be devoting the third session particularly to local issues of homelessness. Go ahead.
I do not know, I am not in any way a mental health expert, right? And there's been a lot of studies about mental health and homelessness that I don't know. I don't know exactly how to delineate them. The LA Times is there was some, I read a poll in the LA Times that, well over half of the homeless folks are pretty severely mentally ill. But that doesn't really jive with what I see. Anyway, here's what I would say though, in my somewhat limited experience. I mean, I've spent a lot of time, reading about homelessness, and I've spent a lot of time interviewing homeless folks, but I've not, I obviously don't have diagnostic power and stuff like that. I think of our homelessness problem as sort of two separate problems. There are folks that you meet who are very visible, who are on the street, who are obviously out of sorts in some way and lack the ability to take care of themselves. Very public, very sad. Then there are folks you meet who live, off in sort of somewhat hard to find but visible homeless camps, who, have trailers back there. They've essentially built homes back there. They have TVs. I spent a lot of time in an Oakland homeless camp where they had figured out how to pull power from the freeway lights. They had a whole, they had lots of things there. They had showers. They would pull water from a fire hydrant and sort of run it through this thing. And when you talk to the people out there, they definitely had drug problems. I assume, they might have had some mental health problems, but they were sort of a different category. They obviously could take care of themselves. They were quite creative. One of them built a movie theater out of a projection on a freeway wall. And they put little seats there, and they all kind of watched the movie together. That's a sort of different group, right? And when you start driving around and looking around, that's the group that's growing. That's the group where the number of encampments is really rapidly expanded, right? And I just think of that group as sort of different. Now, in the 70s, we had, we still have a few in the Tenderloin, what were called single room occupancy hotels. Every city, New York, whatever, the Bowery, there were all sorts of these kind of very, very, very low cost housing options. So I'm not saying they were wonderful options, but they were shelter. They came with bathrooms, whatever. And we got rid of a lot of that housing. And in a mistake that we somehow as a society cannot stop making, we sort of came in with this belief that if we got rid of this housing, which was, not particularly good looking, and the neighborhoods were seedy. But when we got rid of it, somehow those people would go away, and what replaced it would completely change the neighborhood. Well, that's not what happened. The people stayed there, and they lived on streets. And there are all sorts of books at the very beginning of homelessness. In the 80s, a number of grad students studied this, and they drew a clear link between the rising homelessness and the loss of this really low-cost housing option. And to add to that, there are all these homeless programs where they move people to apartments in Stockton and other places, and and then they go back and they're like, wow, this is a success. But the question I always have is, was the success all the stuff they did, or was the success the like $400 apartment they found, right? And so having a really, really, really low cost housing option, I believe, would help us with a lot of the homeless problem that's growing, right? I do agree with you that problem is distinct from people who truly lack any ability to take care of themselves. But I think that if the really severely impaired group was the only group we had, I think we would have a much less severe housing problem right now, homeless problem right now.
The recent acquisition of hotels by the state and the city seems to me to be good evidence that the need for the replace SROs effectively.
I mean, that's basically what they're trying to do. I wrote a whole story about this, and the sort of hilarious part, well, not hilarious, but the sort of interesting thing was that the house, the apartment, the hotel that they converted to an SRO had actually been an SRO many decades earlier. Right. And Randy Shaw actually fought to keep it from being a regular tourist hotel. And I remember he was like, 40 years later, we got it back.
Yeah.
I want to move you. I just want to move on so that everybody gets a chance. The next person who wrote you a note is Ben Bear. And then we have 3 more messages after that. So we've got 4 more people who've got questions. Great. And then I see a hand raised by someone saying named B. Beekman. So that may be 5.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go.
So Ben,
I can just, I can read these if you guys want, but.
Well, yeah. It's nice for everybody to hear everybody's.
Okay, cool.
Unless, Ben, you want to shorten it slightly. If anybody can shorten their questions, that'd probably would be a little helpful. But
Well, yeah, I'll try to shorten it up. Yeah, when we talk about subsidized low-income housing, we're usually talking about rental housing, and you know, our policies that we've had since World War II about subsidizing home ownership, you know, under the GI Bill, all these other things were, you know, that actually created a lot of the problems that we have. And, you know, why can't we do subsidized low-income home ownership? And I just have, you know, myself for an
Yes.
example.
Now, Ben, you also said that you live in St. Francis Square, which is a great project. People around the world talk about it. It was a consciously integrated affordable housing development built by the International Longshore and Warehouse Union Pension Fund. I think I think there's all sorts of ways that people can do that. If the SEIU or any of those other folks who have substantial pension funds of their own now wanted to do something like that, there would be nothing to stop them with. I mean, the ILWU used their own money to do it. So, you know, the sort of irony is we talk so much about how redevelopment was so bad, which, you know, it was, but that was a redevelopment project. So there were, you know, good parts of redevelopment too. It's not to say that that excuses the nasty things that happen in the Fillmore. I think I get this question a lot, not necessarily here, but why don't we have, you know, why do not we have more ownership opportunities in affordable housing? Obviously, Habitat for Humanity is built on this premise. I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, we mostly do affordable housing through America through this like weird tax credit program called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, which is basically what happens is corporations buy tax credits, which are then become equity in rental projects. And it's a very weird system. Anyway, basically the short answer is I completely agree with you. I think that people like California and perhaps to a lesser extent San Francisco or private people like the ILWU have to kind of experiment with these things. Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't, you know, have people lobby for federal legislation to change the, you know, but this tax credit has now, I mean, as always happens, this tax credit has become a whole industry now. You know, there are accountants, there are consultants, there are banks, there are all these people who that's all they do. Now, one of the powerful things about that tax credit is that it's very politically safe. When Donald Trump lowered tax rates for corporations and wealthy people, the tax credit essentially was the funding actually sort of went down, not literally, but because tax rates were lower, people didn't buy as many of the credits. And they immediately passed a bipartisan bill with Maria Cantwell and Senator Orrin Hatch to raise the level of tax credit. So it shows you, you know, there's such an industry behind this tax credit now that it's become politically safe. But as you point out, it's also locked us into this rental model that doesn't give people opportunities to build wealth. It's not to say that a rental model is always bad. It's just to say that does it have to be the only thing we ever do? Right? So I basically completely agree with you. And the question is always like, who's going to leap to create the, you know, the funding for such a thing? And it's telling that, you know, again, I talk to scholars in all over the country, and they will all say to me, you know, there's that St. Francis. I mean, people are fascinated by that project. And, you know, it's unfortunate that something that everyone thinks of as a model has come to be treated as a one-off.
Here's a question from Louise and John. Could you elaborate on the policies that Minneapolis passed to address the lack of affordable housing?
Minneapolis is a, you know, very progressive city. They have they obviously are going through a time right now, but they have historically been a very progressive city, and they are starting to have a housing problem. As it happens, a number of the people on the city council there were had lived in the Bay Area. One in particular, the president of the city council, Lisa Bender, had lived in the Bay Area, and I think even worked in the San Francisco planning department at one point. And they were very conscious that other cities, particularly the Bay Area, had let their problem get way out of control. And they were extremely conscious about, we need to get way ahead of this, right? And so I think that they were trying very hard to be proactive. You know, the other thing about Minneapolis is they're, you know, much like San Francisco, if you go to the older parts of Minneapolis, there are all sorts of little apartment buildings mixed into neighborhoods. You know, you go through the Richmond, you can't build those apartment buildings now, but they're obviously there. I'm sitting here in Noe Valley in a, you know, in a classic Noe Valley Victorian, but I'm looking across the street at a, you know, 4-story apartment building on the corner of Dolores and Jersey. I mean, it's a big apartment. You would never be able to build that apartment building today, right? But it's there now, right? So we walk around our cities, whether they're Minneapolis or San Francisco, and you sort of see these things exist. They can't exist now, right? And so I think Minneapolis was just trying to do this. I think they were just trying to kind of get ahead of it with this triplex thing. Now, I will say, they've only built 17 of them. I think they've only permitted 17 of them. And they do have some pretty strict design restrictions because they want them to look very much like what's already there. So, you know, in Minneapolis, there's a lot of big homes where the third story is kind of like a half story. And so you can't quite see it in the way because of the way the roof is. And that sort of same structure still exists. So you can't build the kind of more rectangular apartment buildings, and the developers all hate that because the third floor is not really a true floor. Anyway, my point is, coming up with the policy and actually getting the housing built has also proved to be somewhat elusive for them. So we'll see how that actually shakes out over the next years.
Here in San
There's a
Francisco,
question
I'm not
here too
mistaken.
about Seattle.
Yeah.
That's even more interesting.
And so can you comment briefly on what's going on in Seattle with affordable housing?
Seattle has done similar things to Minneapolis. I mean, they've made it possible to build. I'm less familiar. I mean, they have this thing called HALA that they've been doing for, you know, years. The housing and affordability. I think it's housing affordability and livability agenda or something like that. But they have this huge process. I don't know. Does somebody know a lot about Seattle? But my essential interpretation of Seattle is they've started to allow brownstone-like developments inside of single-family neighborhoods.
Well, they let people build 7 and 8 of those on a lot, on a city lot, and generally close to light rail stations. I don't know much about it either, but one of our kids lived there, and every time I go there, he seems to know more and keeps showing us more and more stuff that he's found there, and it's very interesting, I thought.
If there is a consistent theme around the country, it is that people are trying to make it easier to build duplexes and triplexes in existing single-family lots, and to allow more ADU developments in backyards, which are, you know, but, you know, some of them are quite large, right? And they're trying to do this in such a way that they are doing most of it around transit. So they have a mile within transit. You know, this is the sort of general theme around the country. I mean, there, you know, right in our
Why
own,
hasn't that never happened here? Then MacArthur BART seems to be really special. I came from the DC area, and virtually every metro station has something next to it like that BART, like what they just built by the MacArthur BART.
No, it's
why
crazy.
it's not done here.
No, it's, well, there, you know, Scott Wiener tried to pass a law that would allow this. I mean, basically, here's what happened. I live in Rockridge now, and every week or every month or whatever, we get a little handout called the Rockridge News, which is like a little pamphlet. And that is a pamphlet put out by the Rockridge Planning Association or Planning Council or something like that, right? Now, this council was developed essentially as an anti-development sort of thing in the 60s, I believe, when BART and the 24 freeway were built. And the city of Lafayette, which is the next BART stop down, incorporated as a city. It was unincorporated land specifically to stop development around BART and the 24 after they were built, and Orinda. Yeah, right. So all along that BART station, people, either through neighborhood or in the power of incorporation, basically as this light rail resource was built, they tried as hard as they could to stop everything near it. And it's really a crime if you think about it, because BART was funded with a lot of regressive taxes that fall harder on poor people. And in essence, we've tried to make it impossible for them to live near it. They're
Isn't
paying,
Rockridge one of those neighborhoods that you were talking about, has lots of small apartment buildings and things like that?
yes, but they exist. You couldn't build one now.
They existed.
Right.
No, you couldn't build them now.
One
Yes.
of the things that
Unless you live along Broadway, that might make it.
Now, so I will say that in California, you are starting to see, I'm actually doing a story on this right now, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but in San Diego, so we now have this accessory dwelling unit legislation that allows you to build, these backyard cottages. And people are really going crazy with that now. Let me tell you, some of the ADUs they're building in San Diego do not look like any granny flat you ever saw. I mean, they're like 4-unit apartment buildings behind like a single family house. So, you are starting to see people experiment with these new policy tools. And I think SB 9 will be a really interesting tool in this regard, because it'll allow you to start selling off these things. You can bring that ownership opportunity to people by subdividing the lot.
That sort of leads into Bruce's question. Bruce, you want to ask your question?
I thought my question was already pretty much spoken.
Answered. Oh, okay. Then we'll move on to Zelda. Is Zelda here? Zelda?
we've lost her.
She was asking a question about triplexes in Minneapolis. And I guess we've already done some of that.
Yes. Now, let me just say one thing, because we're getting close to time. I'm happy to take questions, but I just want to say one thing. We didn't talk that much about the book, and that's fine. We didn't have to have it that, but I want to say the book is really about people. It's about characters who are trying to sort of understand and deal with this housing mess in the way they know how. There's this activist, Sonia, who sort of comes to the Bay Area and tries to sort of create this political movement around more housing. There's a 15-year-old girl named Stephanie Gutierrez who comes home one day and finds an $800 rent increase taped to her door, and pretty much has to become an eviction activist because her parents are Latino immigrants who work 80 hours a week. And you sort of follow her story as she tries to figure out how to become an activist purely to save her, not because she's some political firebrand, but because she wants to keep her family from being homeless. You meet a nun, Sister Christina Heltzley, who is, I feel like, the best housing story in the Bay Area. She raises all this money in the Redwood City. She raises all this money and in the Redwood City area has bought something like $40 million in real estate that she's now deed restricted as affordable forever. It's one of the probably one of the largest or most valuable community land trusts in America, and nobody ever talks about it. There is a developer from Oakland named Rick Holliday, who was one of the founders of Bridge Housing, one of the largest affordable housing developers in the country, but he's now trying to build housing in a factory out in Vallejo so that you can really lower the cost of housing. All these people have weird interlocking stories, and they sometimes end up fighting each other, sometimes end up working with each other. There's the city manager of the city of Lafayette who is trying to sort of get the city to accept a little bit more density, but not too much more density, and trying to sort of find this middle road. He ends up getting squashed in the process, leaving his job. And I think what I tried to bring to this was
about that
empathy.
Remember that story?
Yeah, and what I wanted to sort of bring to it was characters who would allow you to sort of see behind the doors of your own city a little bit, or your own region, if you will, and sort of see the different kinds of housing problems people are dealing with, and sort of understand not just the policy, but also how they feel. You can sort of see why someone like Stephanie, who is purely worrying about her family, still having their home, isn't a political activist for more density, like say someone like Sonia is, right? You can understand why there are legitimate fears of gentrification and where the sort of cross pollination of these politics come from. And I feel like that's the most important part, because when you only talk about policy, it can seem a little lecturing. Anyway, I say this only because I felt like the thing I worked hardest on with this book was making this problem accessible to people, and just honestly trying to just write sentences that didn't put you to sleep. And I think that these characters are fascinating people, because most people don't do what you guys are doing, which is log in to sort of learn something about just kind of their lives. And the people in this book are all people who have really taken it upon themselves to try to solve a problem in the way they know how, but most people don't do that. And so I just think that, anyway, I just wanted to sort of say the book isn't boring, and to sort of
I'll second that. As somebody who's gone through the whole thing, we probably need to wind this up, Robin, but.
Yeah, well, there are a few more questions. Poor B.
No problem.
Has had her hand up. He or she has had a hand up for a long, long time. So I would hate not to
problem.
That person.
Thank you. Blair Beekman here, male, I guess, or I like non-binary. I like non-binary actually, but thank you. My question was the city of Berkeley at their city council in July. They offered like these incredible subsidy plans with all the new subsidy choices that are available at this time that we have to kind of go slow with and question. They're offering what is going to be introduced to the Bay Area in the next year to 2 years to 5 years is to these subsidy programs that can literally pay for like in the current state of transitional housing for homeless. Only 1 in 3 end up moving from transitional to permanent housing, usually because it's too expensive to learn to pay for permanent housing. And these new subsidy programs can cover the costs of people being able to transition from transitional housing to permanent housing. And I think it's an amazing concept of a program. It involves money and the function of money to pay for things. So it's going to have to be kind of responsible how that's done, but it can really, really, I think, be changing a lot in our future. Housing can now be paid for, where people couldn't get housing before. And it'll be interesting to see that work. I thought I would tell yourselves about it and what you guys can be looking for. People want to do this stuff sooner, like now, but it may have to wait, because people have to get acclimated to it, and it's part of the whole COVID-19 stuff. And so, just look into it if you can, and hopefully you'll see it. It's really interesting stuff. Berkeley, I think they introduced it to quickly end here. Berkeley offered it to the city council in July, I think, and that may be a good place to start. Thanks.
Cool. So I do not know this specific program, but just listening to you talk, I have a quick sense of it. Now, one of the themes I'm trying to beat at in this talk, and one I tried to beat at in the book, and sort of the one that I sort of began with that little anecdote about going to Boulder, is that you are seeing the same problems even though housing is fundamentally a local issue, you see the same problems in every kind of growing city, and you were starting to now see the same solutions. I was speaking before about how Seattle and Minneapolis and all these different places are doing accessory dwelling units and duplexes. All these places are trying to do it more near transit. So at one point, me and John were also talking about Section 8 and how it's inadequately funded. You were also now starting to see all sorts of different cities try to come up with some sort of subsidy program of their own. And whether they ever state this explicitly, or it's just sort of implied. What they're trying to do is find some kind of extra way to, if not exactly backfill, to ameliorate a little bit the section, basically that there aren't enough Section 8 funds. So Philadelphia, for instance, has started doing a cash program, a basic income program. It's not a universal basic income, but it's a cash program for lower income families. And even though it's a cash program, it is designed to be a rental subsidy program, but they've designed it as a cash program because that makes it as flexible as possible and allows people to, it makes it easier for them to find housing, because nobody can, it's just a cash housing, right? It's not like a voucher that a landlord has to get involved with and everything. So all around this is all a very long way of saying you are starting to see cities come up with their own sort of subsidy programs. And the reason they're doing it is that Section 8 has proved to be so inadequate for the amount of need that we have in this country. And also because Section 8 vouchers, a landlord has to accept them, about 50% don't. And so if they come up with a cash subsidy program, it makes it really, really, really expands the number of housing options.
I think we really need to wrap this up and keep covenant with the norms of the forum. I want to point out that next week we're going to be focusing on state policy and changes in state policy. Our guest is going to be Assembly Member David Chu, who chairs the Housing and Community Development Committee in the California Assembly. About 6 years ago, when I first came to the city, I met with then President of the Board of Supervisors, David Chu, and I can only tell you that I think his attitudes about the ability to make change in this area have changed considerably. And we're going to be hearing about not only the changes that have been passed by the Assembly, but also about some that are still being debated in the upcoming legislative session. I want to thank Conor and again recommend his book, Golden Gates, published by Penguin in paperback. It is, in fact, a very humanizing story about the way in which the housing crisis comes down to ground right here in our own neighborhood, but does manifest issues that are national in scope and that need our political activism and attention at all levels, local, regional, state, and national. Conor, thank you so much for all the work you do. We'll be looking for your byline in the New York Times as you continue to cover this housing crisis and the Bay Area's role in both exemplifying it and, we hope, ameliorating